Everybody is asking how far the United States can go in the 2026 World Cup. But after watching their latest performance, I think we're asking the wrong question. Because for the first time in modern history, the US might have a weapon that almost nobody is talking about, and it could completely change their World Cup ceiling. The United States just beat Paraguay 4-1. And if you watched that game thinking, nice result, moving on, you missed something that might actually predict how far this team goes in 2026, because the scoreline wasn't the story. Here's what we're doing today. We're going to break down exactly how far the USMNT can realistically go at the 2026 World Cup, but not using the angles you've already heard 100 times. No Pulisic is the key. No home crowd advantage. Instead, we're going to look at the hidden indicators. The stuff buried underneath the highlights that actually tells you whether a team is built to go deep in a tournament. And some of what we found genuinely surprised us. Let's start with the Paraguay game, because it revealed something much bigger than 4 goals. Most US wins against South American opposition follow a very specific script. Chaos, work rate, grit. A goalkeeper making 3 incredible saves. A late winner that nobody saw coming. That's how the old USMNT won games they weren't supposed to win. They survived. Think back to the 2009 Confederations Cup, where the US came back from 2-0 down against Spain, the #1 ranked team in the world at the time, and won 2-0. Incredible result. But watch the footage. It was frantic. It was desperate. It was a team hanging on by its fingernails and somehow converting 2 chances. That's a different category of performance than what we saw against Paraguay. Against Paraguay, the US scored early, went into halftime 3-0 up, and then Mauricio Pochettino started rotating and protecting players. Comfortable. Controlled. The kind of game management you see from teams that know what they're doing. Not a team scrambling. A team administering. That is not normal for this program. And it matters more than people realize. Because here's the thing about tournament football. The teams that go deep don't just win. They win without spending everything they have. Think about how Germany won the 2014 World Cup. They weren't always spectacular. They were efficient. They controlled tempo. They managed leads. The US looked like a team that understood how to manage a match, not just play one. That's a different gear entirely. And it's a gear this program has never reliably had before. But that's only one piece of this. Because there's a second trend that's been quietly building under Pochettino, and it might actually be the most important structural advantage this team has going into 2026. The bench is becoming a weapon. Think about previous US generations. Strong starting 11, weak depth. You'd watch the second half, and it felt like the team got worse when substitutions came on. That's not a small problem in a 48-team World Cup. In the old 32-team format, you could survive on your starting 11 if they were good enough. In a 48-team tournament, you're playing more games, players accumulate fatigue, and knockout rounds get decided by the players who come on in the 65th minute. The difference between a squad and a team becomes brutally obvious by the quarterfinal stage. Against Paraguay, Gio Reyna came off the bench and scored. That's not a footnote, that's a statement. Reyna is a player with genuine Champions League pedigree, and he's coming on as a substitute. In recent camps, players like Tessman, Aronson, and Beholter have come on and changed games. Not just filled minutes, not just kept the ball moving while the starters recovered. They've actually shifted the momentum of matches. There's a real argument that this US squad is the opposite of every previous generation. The depth might actually be stronger than the starting 11, which sounds strange, but in a tournament format, that's exactly what you want. You want opponents to feel like stopping the first wave only brings a second wave that's just as dangerous. Call it the bench effect. And the bench effect could be worth 1 or 2 wins in a knockout bracket that previous US teams never would have gotten. Now, most people previewing this team are going to spend most of their time talking about the attackers. And look, the attackers are good. But the most unusual thing about this USMNT isn't who plays up front. It's the fullbacks. Antonee Robinson and Serginho Dest are not just serviceable international fullbacks. They are genuinely among the best players on this team. Against Germany, Robinson scored from distance. Not a tap-in, not a deflection, a genuine strike from a left-back who had no business being in that position, except that for this team, it makes complete sense. Against Paraguay, both fullbacks were repeatedly stretching the defence and creating width that most national teams simply cannot replicate. Here's why that's strange and important at the same time. Most national teams create width through their wingers. The wide attackers push out, stretch the defence, and the fullbacks provide the underlapping run, or the covering position. The US almost functions in reverse. The width comes from the defenders. That makes this team look more like a modern club side. Think Liverpool under Klopp, with Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson bombing forward simultaneously, than a typical international setup, and it creates problems for opponents who haven't prepared for it. When you have two attacking fullbacks who are both legitimately world-class at what they do, you're essentially playing with a free extra attacker on each side of the pitch. The central midfielders can sit a little deeper, knowing the width is covered. The forwards can drift inside into more dangerous central positions. The entire shape becomes harder to defend because the threat is coming from angles that don't match traditional defensive organisation. Teams that haven't specifically game planned for Robinson and Dest are going to get exposed. And in the early rounds of a World Cup, most teams haven't specifically game planned for you. That's important. But if you don't also understand the development story behind this roster, you're missing the full picture of why this team is structurally different from anything the US has ever put together. The 2002 quarterfinalists, arguably the greatest USMNT achievement in modern history, were largely MLS developed. Players like Landon Donovan, Brian McBride, and Claudio Reyna built their games primarily in the American domestic system before stepping onto the world stage. That team was built through the domestic league system, and it overachieved almost entirely on mentality and organisation. The 2026 squad is something different. Roughly a quarter of the roster followed what you could call the export early pathway. Players who left for Europe as teenagers, developed at the academy level inside top European clubs, and came back as finished products rather than developing ones. Weston McKennie at Juventus, Yunus Musa at Valencia, and then AC Milan. Tyler Adams coming through the Red Bull system in Leipzig. These aren't players who learned the game in MLS and got called up. These are players who were trained inside the same environments that produce the best players in the world. That's a completely different player profile. The technical habits, the tactical understanding, the comfort under pressure in big stadiums, all of it was built inside elite European systems. The US isn't trying to become the old US anymore. They're trying to become something that didn't exist before. Which brings us to something that almost nobody is talking about. And it's actually a potential problem. Because the US automatically qualified as host nation, they skipped CONCACAF qualifying entirely. And CONCACAF qualifying is brutal in a way that's genuinely hard to explain if you haven't watched it closely. Rainy nights in Honduras where the pitch is barely playable. High altitude in Mexico City where your lungs feel like they're working at half capacity. The kind of games where you're 1-0 down in the 75th minute, the crowd is hostile, and you have to find something inside yourself that no training session can manufacture. Those games don't just test your football, they test your character under conditions specifically designed to make you fail. Clint Dempsey, someone who played in those games, who knows exactly what it costs to earn a World Cup spot through qualifying, has argued that missing that process may have actually cheated this team out of the pressure cooker experience they need. And he's not wrong to raise it. There's something about surviving a qualifying campaign that bonds a squad and hardens a mentality in ways that controlled preparation environments simply cannot replicate. The Paraguay performance suggests they may have found other ways to build that edge. But it's a legitimate question, and it leads directly to the one thing that worries me most about this team's ceiling. What happens when they're losing? The 2002 team was physically intimidating. Hard to play against. Hard to break down. The kind of team that made technically superior opponents uncomfortable just by being relentless. The 2010 team was mentally relentless in a different way. Landon Donovan's goal against Algeria in the 91st minute, after a tournament where everything had gone wrong, is the single greatest example of a US team refusing to die. That goal didn't come from talent. It came from a team that had been through qualifying, through difficult nights, through genuine adversity, and still found a way. The 2026 team is technically superior to both of those squads. But technical superiority doesn't tell you what a team does when they're a goal down in the 70th minute against a team that's better than them. It doesn't tell you whether the character is there when comfort disappears. The Paraguay game doesn't answer that question, because the US was comfortable from the first whistle. We haven't actually seen this team's character tested yet. That's the open question that sits at the center of every realistic prediction about how far they go. But here's something that actually does favour them: the tournament format itself. In the old 32-team World Cup, one bad result in the group stage could end your campaign. The margin for error was tiny. One draw, one loss, and suddenly you're doing mathematics just to survive. In the 48-team format, there are more routes into the knockout rounds, including some third-place group finishers advancing. The US doesn't need to be elite to reach the round of 16. They need to be efficient. They need to not self-destruct in one game. They need to manage their group the way a smart team manages a group. Take care of the opponents you should beat, don't lose to the one you might lose to, and let the format do the rest. And once they get to the knockout rounds, the real question becomes, can they beat one giant? That's the ceiling test. Can this team, in a single elimination game against a top 10 nation, find a way to win? Everything else is almost guaranteed. The round of 16 is the floor. The quarterfinal is the wall. Which brings us to the one position that could determine everything. And it's not the one anyone's talking about: goalkeeper. Look at every World Cup dark horse team that made a deep run in the last 20 years. Almost every single one of them had a goalkeeper who stole at least one game. Brad Friedel in 2002, making save after save to keep the US alive. Tim Howard in 2014, putting together one of the greatest individual goalkeeping performances in World Cup history against Belgium. 16 saves, a record, a performance that single-handedly kept the US in a game they had no right to still be in. Guillermo Ochoa for Mexico in that same tournament. Diogo Costa for Portugal in 2022. The goalkeeper who makes 3 impossible saves in a knockout game is not a bonus, he's a requirement. Without that performance, those teams go home earlier. It's that simple. The US does not have a universally accepted number 1 right now. There are real questions around Matt Freese and the pecking order that haven't been resolved publicly. And in a tournament where you need your goalkeeper to steal a match at some point, not maybe, not possibly, but almost certainly at some point, uncertainty at that position is the single biggest threat to a deep run. You can have the best fullbacks in the tournament. You can have the deepest bench. If you don't have a goalkeeper who can stand on his head for 90 minutes when everything else breaks down, the quarterfinal wall stays a wall. If the goalkeeper question gets answered, if someone steps up and becomes that guy, the ceiling on this team rises dramatically. Now, before we get to the final prediction, drop a comment right now. Tell me, what round do you think the US goes out? And if you want more breakdowns like this one, tactical analysis, roster deep dives, tournament predictions, subscribe and hit the bell. We do this kind of content every week, and the next video is going to cover something even more specific about how Pochettino is setting up the team tactically. Here's the thing about Pochettino that nobody is saying loudly enough. Most conversations about this team focus on the roster, the players, the talent. But Mauricio Pochettino has coached in Champions League semi-finals. He took Tottenham to a Champions League final in 2019, a club that hadn't been to one in decades, by outmaneuvering Manchester City in one of the most tactically intelligent two-legged ties in recent memory. He's managed Premier League title races at Southampton and Spurs, operating in environments where the pressure is constant and the margin for error is zero. He's operated in World Cup final environments through his connection to Argentine football. He understands elite pressure not as a concept, but as a lived experience. The US has had talented rosters before. What they've rarely had is a manager who has actually stood in the dugout when everything is on the line and found a way to make the right call. A manager who knows what it feels like when the pressure is at its absolute maximum and can still think clearly. That's not something you learn from a coaching manual. That's something you earn through years of high-stakes experience. Pochettino has it. Most previous USMNT managers simply didn't. The most important USMNT player in 2026 might not be a player at all. And finally, here's the historical pattern that should make every American football fan feel genuinely optimistic. The US tends to outperform expectations precisely when nobody expects a deep run. 1930. Semi-finalists. Nobody predicted that. They were a team of largely amateur players who went to Uruguay and beat Belgium and Paraguay before losing to Argentina. 2002. Quarter-finalists. Nobody predicted that either. They beat Portugal, drew with South Korea, beat Mexico, and pushed Germany to the absolute limit before going out. Both times, the US arrived without the weight of expectation, played with freedom, and shocked the world. 2026. Expectations are strangely modest, despite this being arguably the most talented American squad ever assembled. People are talking about the round of 16 like it's an achievement. For a host nation with this roster and this manager, that should be the starting point, not the destination. Host nations carry momentum from the tournament itself. The crowd, the energy, the entire country watching. It does something to a team that's genuinely hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. France in 1998, Germany in 2006, Brazil in 2014, although that one went differently. The home environment elevates teams. But the US isn't carrying Brazil-level pressure. Nobody expects them to win it. That combination, genuine talent, home energy, and low external pressure, is historically dangerous for every opponent they face. So, here's where we land. The bench effect gives them depth no previous US team had. The fullbacks give them a structural weapon most opponents won't be ready for. The development story means this roster was built differently from the ground up. The tournament format means the round of 16 is almost a given. And Pochettino is the kind of manager who knows how to win the games that matter most. The ceiling is a quarterfinal. Maybe a semi-final if the goalkeeper question gets answered and the team shows us what they do when they're actually under pressure. But here's the real question, the one that actually matters. The question isn't whether this is the most talented American team ever assembled. It clearly is. The question is whether this is the first American team that can control matches against elite opposition, instead of just surviving them. Against Paraguay, for 90 minutes, it looked like the answer might actually be yes.